History as It Happens, June 14th, 2022. Andrew Bacevich has seen this movie before.
America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam. But it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished, as far as America is concerned.
It was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a major military bastion to export terror and undermine democracy. We got there just in time.
I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
In Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, in proxy wars during the Cold War, in interventions across the globe, the United States has sought victories to, as our leaders might say, defend our freedom, uphold our credibility, complete our mission as the world's indispensable power. This is why the war in Ukraine is framed not merely as a regional dispute between Moscow and Kyiv, but as part of a global struggle against autocracy. And there's no way America can stay on the sidelines. There's a pattern here of a nation seeking redemption through violence. And that's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
You know, it's an interesting phenomenon, this urge to take an event and sort of paint it with an ideological outer coat in what I think are utterly inappropriate ways. And you've just cited the example that, you know, this is now, the war is depicted as something of cosmic importance.
In May 1975, just a week after the fall of Saigon, reporter Helen Thomas asked President Gerald Ford a question about the long war that had ended in communist victory and American humiliation.
What are the lessons of Vietnam in terms of the presidency, the Congress, and the American people, in terms of secret diplomacy and fighting a land war in Asia? Also, would you welcome a congressional inquiry into how we got in and how we got out of Vietnam?
Ms. Thomas, the war in Vietnam is over. It was sad and tragic in many respects. I think it would be unfortunate for us to rehash allegations as to individuals that might be to blame or administrations that might be at fault. It seems to me that it's over. We ought to look ahead, and I think a congressional inquiry at this time would only be divisive, not helpful.
President, may I ask you then, don't you think that we can learn from the past?
Ms. Thomas, I think the lessons of the past in Vietnam have already been learned. Learned by presidents, learned by Congress, learned by the American people, and we should have our focus on the future. And as far as I'm concerned, that's where we will concentrate.
A nation that had gone through Watergate, Nixon's resignation, and an excruciating finale in Saigon after Congress refused Ford's 11th hour request for more aid, $300 million to South Vietnam. This nation had learned its lesson, the president said at that news conference. Well, the war did leave a gash in the American psyche, and it was said an aversion to sending our soldiers overseas, known as the Vietnam Syndrome. Now, you might be thinking, good, because, well, wars are bad. Vietnam was an epic disaster. But American politicians soon wanted to kick the Vietnam Syndrome, while, of course, avoiding another quagmire. Ronald Reagan found such a victory in 1983 in a tiny island near the South American coast.
I believe our government has a responsibility to go to the aid of its citizens if their right to life and liberty is threatened. The nightmare of our hostages in Iran must never be repeated. We knew we had little time and that complete secrecy was vital to ensure both the safety of the young men who would undertake this mission and the Americans they were about to rescue.
October 25, 1983, the U.S. invaded Grenada, where about 1,000 Americans were living, many of them medical students. It took all of 4 days for the small contingent of U.S. troops to wrest control of the island from the Grenadan armed forces and their Cuban helpers. 19 Americans died, and Grenada was saved, according to the president, saved from becoming a Soviet-Cuban bastion. Reagan was looking for a victory after so many humiliating defeats: Vietnam, the Iran hostage crisis, and just days before the invasion of Grenada, the bombing of the Marines barracks in Lebanon. But Grenada could only go so far in kicking the Vietnam syndrome. In 1990, after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the United States would finally regain its mojo and prove to the world wars could be won with ease, and American hegemony upheld as the Soviet Union disintegrated.
From the moment Operation Desert Storm commenced on January 16th until the time the guns fell silent at midnight 1 week ago, this nation has watched its sons and daughters with pride, watched over them with prayer. As Commander-in-Chief, I can report to you our armed forces fought with honor and valor. And as President, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
But a decade later, on September 11th, 2001, the al-Qaeda attacks gashed the American psyche again. But this time there'd be no half measures, no limited campaigns, no tiny islands to invade. As President George W. Bush said in his second inaugural address, by which time the war in Iraq was going sideways, that would be the second war in Iraq, the U.S. would seek to end tyranny anywhere and everywhere.
So it is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world.
You can see the pattern here, and it's been a pattern of failure. The most recent one was in Afghanistan, where the U.S. mission drifted for 20 years until the final withdrawal.
I'm now the fourth United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility on to a fifth.
Yet our nation continues to seek redemption in war, to locate its purpose, to fulfill some historic mission. As historian Andrew Bacevich wrote in The Nation in an essay titled "The Ukraine Conflict is Not About American Freedom," more than a few American observers saw in the war evidence that another transformative moment was at hand. Despite or because of the fact that U.S. forces played no direct role in the fighting, history was once more taking a sharp turn, and this time it promised to be for the better. The Russia-Ukraine War of 2022, wrote Bacevich, is ostensibly nudging history back on track. Francis Fukuyama, the author of the End of History thesis, expects a Russian defeat in Ukraine that'll make possible a new birth of freedom and get us out of our funk about the declining state of global democracy. What Fukuyama refers to as the spirit of 1989 will thus live on, thanks to a bunch of brave Ukrainians. That is Andrew Bacevich writing in The Nation, historian, author, Vietnam veteran, and now president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So, in my most recent episode, Choosing War, when I spoke to Jeffrey Engel and Jeremy Surrey, I raised some of these deeper issues, these patterns, when assessing how the United States became Ukraine's defender on the so-called front line in a global struggle against autocracy, where American freedom and values are also somehow at stake, meaning we can't afford to see the Ukrainians lose. Casting the war in these grandiose ideological terms is a way to justify sending $53 billion in aid and arms to Ukraine. But what does victory actually look like? Will some future U.S. president be standing at a podium one day explaining why a noble cause ended in failure? Andrew Bacevich, welcome back. It is always an honor to have you here.
Glad to be with you.
When we last spoke, it was before the war began. We were discussing NATO and your argument, made for some years now, that years ago the U.S. should have left NATO, left European security to the Europeans. Well, here we are, 100 days, more than 100 days into the war. What are your concerns about where this war is going from a U.S. point of view?
Well, I think we should always be cautious in the middle of any war to make any kind of predictions about, oh, this is what's going to happen next, this is how it's going to end up. If we've learned nothing from the history of warfare, it should be that wars are inherently unpredictable. There have been plenty of surprises already in this one. The almost unimaginable incompetence of the Russian army during the war's first stages. So I make no pretense of being able to predict how it's going to come out. It does appear that it's going to continue for some period of time. I am concerned that the longer the war continues, the more problematic the outcome will be for the United States. Whatever the outcome of the war ends up being, this is going to create very large problems for us down the road. And of course, there's always that concern that what has been for us a proxy war could become a war in which we are more directly involved. That has potentially catastrophic implications.
And you wrote in The Nation that too many American leaders, public intellectuals, such as Anne Applebaum and Francis Fukuyama, they're talking about this war as part of a global struggle. It's a seductive idea that we can push back autocracy. Your argument in The Nation was, this is not about our freedom. It might be about the Ukrainians' freedom, but it's not about ours.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, this urge to take an event and sort of paint it with an ideological outer coat in what I think are utterly inappropriate ways. And you've just cited the example that, this is now, the war is depicted as something of cosmic importance, democracy against autocracy, the future of freedom somehow hinging on the outcome. It does seem that there is a type of American intellectual that gets drawn to that sort of extreme rendering of events. I don't know that I can explain why that is the case, but it is the case, and the current war offers a good example.
It's a trap, wouldn't you say?
Well, I think so, because if one would agree, yes, the future of freedom is at stake in this war, well, then, by God, who are we to sit on the sidelines? Who are we to pretend that spending $40 or so billion is a sufficient commitment? We ought to be all in. I don't think we should be all in. I don't think that the future of freedom rests on the outcome of this war. But for those who make that argument, it seems to me that we're not manning up here. Although I suppose manning up is a politically incorrect expression.
That's okay. This is a no woke zone, but I get what you mean. I've been grappling with this question too, because if you take the narrow view, what we're doing makes perfect sense. Ukraine is essentially a de facto U.S. ally, a de facto member of NATO. So Russia invades in February, we have to support them. But if you take the broader view and try to get underneath the patterns we see repeating in U.S. history, Russia is, yes, responsible for the war. But why does the United States find itself in this situation where we're helping defend a country that President Obama said in 2016 was not a core U.S. interest?
The war needs to be understood in a broader context. And the broader context, to my mind, I'm sure there are several ways to describe a broader context here, but I think the broader context to me that's relevant has to do with the fate of the American project we initiated in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. The 9/11 attacks shouldn't have happened. We knew we were the world's sole superpower. That, of course, had been determined as a result of the end of the Cold War. Now here, out of the blue, literally out of the blue, there was this terrible attack on our country, killing thousands, and calling into question then whether or not the end of history, to use Fukuyama's phrase, whether the end of history had actually arrived. And the George W. Bush administration, followed by the Obama administration, to my mind, set out to demonstrate that 9/11 meant nothing, that the American model, the American way, was still predetermined to triumph. And so the larger purpose of then going to war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere was to demonstrate that 9/11 really had not meant anything significant, that we were still the sole superpower, that liberal democracy as defined by the United States was still destined to triumph. And guess what? That project, the project that began with the invasion of Afghanistan in, October of 2001, that continued until 20 years, until the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the project that had manifestly failed I think the response to the Ukraine war expressed a determination among political elites to show that the 20-year failure of the post-9/11 military enterprise actually didn't mean anything, that we were still the world's indispensable nation, that liberal democracy will still prevail across the face of the globe. And I think at some level, that defines the stakes in Ukraine in the eyes of American elites, and in particular of the American foreign policy establishment.
Would you say that we're grasping at a world order that really only exists in our imagination? That the world,
totally.
It's a multipolar world now.
We do live in a multipolar world. Now, we could have probably an interesting discussion with plenty of disagreement about what are the poles. I mean, the obvious answer is that People's Republic of China has emerged, not is emerging, has emerged as a bona fide great power, in many respects, a competitor to the United States. I don't think so much militarily, but I think in terms of economy, commerce, technology, international clout. That said, it's not a bipolar world. It's not a new version of the Cold War, which, again, I think in an oversimplified model, was said to pit the United States against the Soviet Union. What we have today is the United States as certainly a great power, China as a great power. And then in a sense, we've got another tier of powers that may not be quite as influential, but which cannot be ignored. And that's when we're talking about the European Union, and we're talking about Russia, and we're talking about countries like Turkey,
yes.
And a handful of others, all of whose interests are going to have to be taken into account if we're going to have some kind of a decency and stability in terms of the world order. Not because the outcome that we're headed toward is going to be universal American-style liberal democracy, but in hopes that what we're headed toward is an international system in which coexistence prevails, and therefore war is avoided. To me, that's the best we can hope for. Coexistence, no war, that will be an enormous achievement in the 21st century.
To your point about the Afghanistan debacle that unfolded over 20 years, would you say there is a pattern here in U.S. history of seeking national regeneration through violence?
I think that goes too far. I do think that there is a recurring temptation to believe that through violence we can push back against unfavorable circumstances, get the project back on track again. And we have repeatedly misunderstood the potential of what violence can achieve, and we certainly have repeatedly failed to anticipate the unintended consequences of this reliance on violence.
And one other point about your answer involving Afghanistan. In my most recent episode, I brought up Vietnam comparisons. I spoke to Jeremy Surrey and Jeffrey Engel, and maybe some of my listeners thought I was crazy bringing up Vietnam. After all, it's Russia that started this war, not the United States. But I think the point here, and I'm interested in your view on this as a retired Army colonel and Vietnam veteran, Andrew Bacevich, once you cross the line, it becomes so much more difficult to get out. In '65, when LBJ sent in the Marines to Da Nang, everyone knew, all informed observers, according to the historian Frederick Logevall, knew that a line had been crossed, and from that point on, it would be so much more difficult to get out. And I think we're finding ourselves in that situation now in Ukraine. And we don't have ground troops in the country, probably won't have ground troops in the country, but we have to ask ourselves, where is this going?
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I probably refer to Vietnam more frequently than I should in trying to bolster some particular argument.
Yeah, I do too, and I was born in '75, so maybe I shouldn't.
But I think your basic point is dead on. Once we suffer losses, once American blood has been spilled, the instinct is to double down. The instinct is to place another bet on the table and to try to get some kind of a positive payoff for the sacrifices that have been made. And in that regard, this is a very peculiar kind of a war because it's a proxy war. There have been, to our knowledge, and I say it that way because I suspect there's quite a bit that has happened in Ukraine involving U.S. personnel that we are not privileged to know. But once it turns out that Americans have been killed, then it becomes very difficult to turn back, I think.
And U.S. intelligence was used to help kill Russian generals, or at least that was the claim, made in public. Russia does not view that as a non-escalatory type of thing. I think this is the key question, if I may, and I wish I had brought this up in my most recent episode with Suri and Engel. It may be possible that no amount of U.S. support will prevail because Russia will always have military preeminence over its neighbor. And that is why President Obama said we have to stay out of there, more or less. I mean, his administration did help Ukraine to some degree. But if victory is not possible, then maybe getting involved in the first place is not a wise decision. Easier said than done.
As the conversation about Ukraine has evolved, at least as I have followed that conversation, we're having new terms becoming included in the conversation, like victory or winning, with the purpose of Ukrainian policy, the purpose of NATO policy, the purpose of our policy, even if our involvement is at some distance. The purpose is to defeat Russia. Certainly, the purpose is explicitly to weaken Russia. And my point here is that the conversation then, it's a military conversation. Victory and defeat, those are primarily military terms, I think. And this gets to your point, that regardless how this war ends, even if the war ends in what can be termed a Ukrainian victory, I have no idea what that would look like, even if it ends in a Ukrainian victory, and this I think gets to your key point, when the shooting stops, there's going to be this entity called Ukraine living next door to this entity called Russia. Nothing is going to change that. What's more important than as is often the case in war, what's more important than the military outcome is the political conclusion, the political settlement. What needs to happen, the longer the war goes on, I think this becomes more difficult to arrange, but what needs to happen is some type of political settlement in which Ukraine and Russia find a way to live alongside one another. No victory by Ukraine is going to make Russia disappear, unless we have some fantasy of Russia itself somehow disintegrating into what? I don't know.
My point here is not to excuse Russia, it's to recognize that Russia has not been a good actor on the global stage. You also wrote a piece in Tom Dispatch that I found very interesting about Timothy Snyder, the historian, who I have invited on the podcast, haven't made that work yet. He wrote an argument about fascism and the 1930s. And the reason why I found your piece in Tom Dispatch so timely, I had Ian Kershaw on the podcast a couple of months ago, the great historian of the Third Reich and Hitler biographer, to talk about parallels to the 1930s. And our conclusion was they're pretty weak. You really can't make a strong parallel between what's happening now and the disorder and the rise of fascism in the 1930s.
I agree with it. I mean, I think that whenever we introduce terms like fascism, or for that matter, communism, or references to genocide into a conversation, the effect, I think, tends to be to distort rather than to clarify. If indeed Russia is a fascist nation, that the Putin regime is a fascist regime, implicitly likened to Hitler's Third Reich, then what is it incumbent upon us to do? Well, the answer is, it's incumbent upon us to destroy that regime, to spare no sacrifice. And to me, that's a ridiculous prospect. I'm certainly not a defender of Putin. He holds principal responsibility for this war, which did begin as a war of aggression. But to tag Putin with being a fascist and his government with being a fascist regime is simply, A, not accurate, and B, it's not helpful. So I think Timothy Snyder is a brilliant and accomplished historian. But I think that his misuse of that kind of terminology actually makes it more difficult for us to find a path that will bring this war to an end. And that is the near-term imperative.
Yes.
To stop the fighting and then to try to repair the damage that has resulted from this catastrophe.
That's why some people are proposing, even though they don't have the authority to do so, that Ukraine cede territory. Rather than fight for months or years over the Donbass, cede the Donbass now and save thousands of people's lives. That, of course, assumes that Russia would be satisfied with the Donbass. Part of me believes that Putin wants still to conquer the whole of Ukraine. About this fascism argument, the other day I saw a column in the National Review saying that to understand Putin, you have to see him as a Marxist-Leninist. What I think he is a nationalist, as was Yeltsin, as was Gorbachev, who all said Ukraine is basically part of Russia. Maybe they believe that idea to differing degrees of intensity. Obviously, to Putin, it's gospel. But yes, it's easy to attach the fascist label and invoke Hitler, the Third Reich, 1938, and swallowing up Czechoslovakia. Sorry again for going on there, Andrew.
No, I think you're exactly right. It's an excuse to avoid thinking, because the answers are self-evident. Once we decide that Putin is another Hitler, then, well, we know what to do. And this is the recurring problem with U.S. policy. We're always discovering another Hitler. A fairly recent, obvious example would be the way that the elder Bush and then the younger Bush described Saddam Hussein. Now, Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. He was a bad actor. I mean, he was brutal. And yes, the world is a better place when he's gone. But he was not Hitler.
Saddam Hussein is literally trying to wipe a country off the face of the earth. We do not exaggerate, nor do we exaggerate when we say Saddam Hussein will fail.
The notion that he was depicting him as a new Hitler formed part of the justification offered for us invading Iraq in 2003. Guess what? That was a disaster. And perhaps if we, the American people, not to mention our leaders, had a more realistic understanding of what Saddam was all about, maybe would have been less eager to invade and occupy that country.
And of course, to whom Saddam owed the survival of his regime in the 1980s.
Well, indeed. You see, but you're making a good point. If you sort of expand the boundaries of history, suddenly things become more complicated.
The answer to that was Ronald Reagan. His administration helped Saddam survive the Iraq-Iran war, which was started by Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein.
That's right, yes. Yeah, he was always an SOB, but he was our SOB for a short period of time there. So how do we break this pattern from, again, a U.S. point of view? My concern here is, as an American citizen and as an American journalist who's exhausted by forever war, we're $53 billion into this. Congress is not really debating it. There was some pushback about this latest aid package. The American people aren't really paying attention to this as much, understandably so. They go to the gas station and a gallon of gasoline is $6.50 or whatever. What I'm trying to say is Americans have other things on their mind right now. So how do we break this pattern?
You're asking the key question, and you're asking a guy who doesn't have a very good answer.
Well, neither do I.
We are not a well-educated people. We are a people who, I think, prefer a mythic rendering of our own past. And therefore, we become susceptible to historical narratives that falsify, that don't give the whole story. If indeed we're a democracy, we are a democracy. But if indeed we wish to have a democracy which is informed by effective governance, somehow or other we have to be better informed than we are. We blame the media for our failure to follow what's going on. We blame the educational system. And I simply do not have a good answer for how to fix that.
Sorry to interrupt. Informed people, though, people who do know better. I'll mention them again, not to pick on them. Anne Applebaum, Francis Fukuyama, people whom I respect. I've had, as I mentioned, Mr. Fukuyama on the podcast. Robert Kagan. They know the recent history about our failures overseas, yet they're pushing this democracy versus autocracy seductive idea that's pulling us into this situation.
But they're really smart people. and they're articulate, and they're accomplished, and they're influential. But they're also ideologues. You know, people like Robert Kagan, who I think as a pundit, there's a brilliance there that helps to explain why he's as influential as he is. But he's an ideologue. And I think ideologues are in the business of promoting an ideological point of view, and they're not particularly in the business of trying to tease out complicated truths that may be at odds with their larger agenda. So, you know, again, the answer to your question is Bob Kagan should have less influence, and, you know, perhaps those historians, Jeremy Surrey and who else he had on from Southern Methodist, Jeffrey Engel,
Yes.
Maybe they should be more prominent than they are. How to get there, I don't know.
I'll close with this, since you mentioned this in one of your earlier books, Washington Rules. You yourself went through as I did as well, I'll say an ideological or an intellectual transformation. You were once a believer. You were in the military, you were in Vietnam, you were in West Germany, if I'm not mistaken, when the wall came down.
That's right.
You eventually changed your worldview.
Well, you have to be open to learning, right? I hope I have been. I hope I am. But I mean, a lot of people aren't.
Well,
a lot of people make up their minds at an early age, and they know what they know, and they stop thinking, they stop growing. I think it's a problem in our whole country.
It's an emotional need to believe in the righteousness of our cause. And I was right there. Of course, I didn't really know anything when I was in my 20s. And I thought the war in Iraq in 2003 was the right thing to do. That was probably the worst judgment I've ever demonstrated on any issue of importance in my entire life. But I did learn from it. But I'm not at the other end of the spectrum either, where, what was it, J.D. Vance, the Senate candidate from Ohio, famously said recently, in so many words, I don't care what happens in Ukraine. We have our own problems here. Let those people 6,000 miles away deal with their own problems.
Yeah, I think there's middle ground here. No, we can't turn our backs on the world. I mean, isolationism, which in my view has never existed, is not a realistic proposition. We have to deal with the world. We have to learn how to deal with the world with as it is, rather than the world that we would like to exist. And for people in Washington, that's a struggle.
Andrew Bacevich, we thank you for your wisdom. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the January 6th committee hearing shed new light on a dark day, at a time when Americans are said to be divided over everything, when conspiracy theories prevail over facts, when each side views the other as an existential threat to the Constitution and country. Kind of like the 1790s. We're going to speak to Joseph Ellis about that next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.